Okay, so we are still in chapter 5. This is the second part. Certain sections might be somewhat easier, but on average, it's still a pretty dense and mysterious chapter. So I'll try to do my best again to dispel some of the murkier parts. Okay, so just to remind ourselves about the overall structure of the chapter. So last time we covered the first part where I emphasized that there is a very important segment or section which is not really delineated as a separate section and which covers this question about the relevance or significance of organs for the ongoing dialectic exchange between what Plessner calls functional unity and systemic unity. So the living being as a gestalt and the living being as a whole. And then we went through several explications of this unique dynamic that he's trying to flesh out, where we emphasized the importance of life cycle and the positional field, assimilation and dissimilation, adaptation and adaptedness. And I'll briefly mention some of the things that we were kind of talking about on the next slide. But today we'll be moving on to a further explication of this dynamic, which deals with reproduction, heredity, and selection. And then we'll also have a brief look at two main organizational forms that Plessner introduces, namely the open form, which stands for plants, and the closed form, which stands for animals. So last time we did our best to underline and try at least to understand the significance of organs for Plessner's account of the living. And we said that because organs in a certain sense embody this dialectic between specialization and openness, so they are in a certain sense specialized, semi-autonomous entities, but they're also open in the sense of that they are integrated into the system of organs. They provide the, they meet the criteria for being the topoi where the relationship between functional unity and systemic unity takes place. And this ongoing processual movement between functional unity and systemic unity is Plessner's response to both Köhler and Driesch, as we said. So unfortunately, there's no room for Deleuzian bodies without organs. Organs are, as we have seen, in a certain sense, crucial if we want to have living bodies proper. And then because of these two aspects of organs, namely specialization and openness, particularly openness, Plessner claims or points out that the organism as a vehicle or a system of organs must itself also be always open. So it is never fully self-enclosed because that would spell death, and is therefore always embedded into a field that is its opposite. So into a certain positional field, an Umwelt, if you like. And this oppositionality is basically an inherent feature of his understanding of positionality. And I'll say a bit more later on. Then we try to show how this relationship between organism and its positional field, which is characterized by both openness and closedness, both connection and separation, is possible. And basically Plessner says that the reason why it's possible is because there is a certain duality or polarity within the organism itself. So there is an ongoing dynamic between assimilation and dissimilation, that is to say between deconstruction and construction. And again, organs play a crucial role here, so that basically the self-identity of the living being is actually an ongoing dynamic between self-assertion and self-abandonment. So it is, again, not something that would be just unipolarly related to self-assertion or self-closedness. And this is also then related to the question about the relationship between adaptedness and adaptation. And we've said that according to Plessner, there is an ongoing, because of the dynamic structure that he has depicted, there is an ongoing dialectic between synchrony with the environment, which is basically the moment of adaptedness, and this pertains to the form of the living being, and also an ongoing adjustment with regards to the content. So the environment of the organism changes with regards to its physical chemical constitution, and therefore the organism has to constantly adapt. Okay, I would like to underscore what I think is really important in this first part. This also pertains to something that Primož asked. So what I think is the takeaway of this first part, and is also important for what we will be doing today and also later on. Namely, Plessner tries to sketch out the dynamics of this oppositional or positional logics that is crucial for the organism. And we can basically say that, as I've tried to point out, that this is basically a dynamical logic. So what is crucial for the living beings, that they are processual dynamic units, and there has to be an ongoing attempt to maintain a certain self-difference, which allows for a specific type of integrity or a specific type of positioning yourself towards something. And this oppositional logic is basically characterized by having a certain polarity, a certain opposition, which is crucial for you to basically enact or embody a certain unity. And I've said that there is an interesting correlation or a certain mirror image between an inner and outer positionality. So basically, we've seen that the organism is characterized by an inner polarity, which is basically the dynamics between assimilation and dissimilation, construction and destruction. And this then translates into a certain polarity, oppositionality that is characteristic for its relationship with its environment. So there's a dialectic between closure and openness, between the organism being in opposition with its environment and also in accordance with its environment. And this oppositional logic is basically the logics of the unfolding or the actualization. So again, something processual. So the boundedness, the nature of the boundary is actually the enactment of this positing. So when he talks about positionality, it's not something that is just, an act that is done, but an act that has to be maintained. So it is an ongoing act. And we can basically present the same thing, what I've characterized here as the ongoing dialectic between inner and outer, by simply projecting this dynamic into the relationship between the systemic unity and the functional unity. Yeah, so the topic that was crucial for what we were saying. I said that Plessner is basically trying to kind of open up a middle way between Köhler and between Driesch. And he is trying to find a way how this systemic unity, which is the wholeness of the living being, is related to the functional unit, which is the physical gestalt or the bodily gestalt of the living being. We said that the systemic unity is this actual possibility or potency that is related to the living being, and that the functional unity is related to actuality of the living being, so the gestalt that you see. And we see that the systemic unity is basically the dimension of the living being, which is related to this assimilation construction aspect in the inner of the organism, and the closure or being in opposition with its positional field in the outer field. Whereas the functional unit is the aspect which is dimension of the living being which is related to the dissimilation or destruction on the inside and the openness and being in accordance with the outer side. So we see that basically these two unities are specific dynamic unities that are responsible for maintaining this two-aspectual ongoing processual logic that is characteristic of the living being. And the crucial point here, and this will be important also for today's chapter, is that what is characteristic of the living being is that it is a whole that is characterized by immediate centrality. So it is never an immediate centrality. Immediate centrality would mean that it would be either anchored in the outside or in the inside. It is neither. So it is always something that is mediated and requires opposition, requires the oppositionality to constitute itself, to actualize itself, to manifest itself. So it is a unity in and through the polarity. So it is not, whenever you get focused on either one side or the other, you've missed the living being or the aliveness of the living being. So in order for you to have vitality, you have to basically be able to see how this unity actualizes itself in and through the oppositionality. Okay, so now we're moving on to the last segment. So last feature that we were not that was not dealt with previously, namely reproduction, heredity, and selection. It's a really strange section. There are not many concrete examples. So I'll try to do my best to kind of outline some of the main points that Plessner is making here. So Plessner starts off by delineating the relationship of the living beings towards future. And he says that basically there are two ways in which we can talk about this relationship. If we talk from a formal or a structural perspective, that is to say, if we talk about how living beings as such relate to their future, Plessner says that they are grounded in future. What he means by that is that they are characterized by these features such as that the living being is not yet, that the living being is a present being, so this presence and whatnot. So these are formal or structural features of aliveness as such. However, if we talk about individual living beings, so if we take a particular stance, if we focus on one individual living being, then we see that this living being is related to the future in the sense of that it is a being that is constantly becoming, that is developing, and also aging and dying. So he says that this, he kind of characterizes all these different facets by the term aging. He says that the living being, the living individual, is bounded by death. And he says that what is characteristic of the living being is the gradual decrease of unevolved potential due to its involvement in the developmental process. So this kind of slowly hinders circulation within the organism and hinders adaptation and eventually leads to death. Now, if this were the case, I mean, if this was the sole process that was present in the living beings, we wouldn't have living beings. So the logic of aliveness needs to have something that would counteract aging. And this is basically the process of renewal. When he talks about renewal, he means the process of regeneration and reproduction. And from what I was able to gather, mostly he refers to reproduction. So what has to be understood here, says Plessner, is that the renewal is not to be understood as something that pertains to some life as some external force that can only to a limited degree manifest itself in the physical form. So this is the wrong way to picture this. If you think that life as probably some as some Lebensphilosophen did, that living force is something that is external to the physical forms and can only to a certain degree actualize itself, and that this is what constitutes, the dimensions of regeneration and reproduction, you are missing the point. According to Plessner, basically the renewal is a process that is the other side of the aging process. So it is basically a process that is an essential feature of the living beings and is there to balance out the aging. So it has to be there in order for living beings not to simply disappear. And the idea, again proposed by some Lebensphilosophen, probably that, we should kind of strive to attain the level where regeneration would supersede aging. This would be, basically working against life, because if this were to happen, then life wouldn't be life anymore, because it would become something static and it would lose its dynamism. So I'm guessing that this would have interesting implications for example, topics of life extension, or the idea of achieving immortality. Plessner would have apparently huge issues with this. For him, probably this would mean the end of life in a certain sense, or at least a radical restructuration of the phenomenon that we call life. So when he talks about renewal, he says that with regards to unicellular organisms, this renewal is focused or related primarily to individuals, because with them, what you see is that renewal is actually a negation of aging. So you have, whenever a renewal happens, the individual dies. So basically it splits into two and there is no more living being or something like that. I'm not really sure how, to what degree this fits the whole microbiological understanding of unicellulars now, but let's leave that aside. But with regards to multicellulars, he says the renewal is related primarily to species. So it is here, it is not a negation of aging, but compensation of aging. And he emphasizes the importance of the germline. So this would be basically the chromosomes and the DNA and everything. So in contemporary terminology. And this germplasm, he says, is a reserve fund. He tries then to kind of explicate this a little bit. One thing that he points out is that by saying that renewal is related to the species and not to individuals, that is to say, the individual kind of goes through the whole cycle. So he is born, he ages, and he dies. So the life is not ended when that particular individual reproduces, but goes the whole cycle. And for this reason, basically, the renewal is related to the species as a whole and not to that particular individual. But he tries to kind of point out that this shouldn't be misunderstood. So when he says that the species is at the forefront here, this shouldn't be understood in terms that the species is primary. So species is not something supra-individual, some telos that is out there, and only individuals are basically, in a certain sense, just kind of either moving towards this super individual, or they are merely manifestations of it. But he says that species are something that, again, gets actualized in and through individuals. So the species is the form of the individual, and it is anticipated individual's development. It is not something that can be severed from it. It is not something that can be abstracted from the developing individual. He draws a parallel here between and says that the relationship between the individual and species is the same as the body towards its type. And this is something that he covered previously in the book. And basically this relationship for him is the relationship between the real and the ideal. And this is, again, one of those passages that is not particularly clear, but here's what I was able to understand from this. If I understood him correctly, the only way, the only time that it is legitimate for us to talk about ideality and even teleology of sorts is when we are talking about becoming individuals or becoming bodies. So bodies or individuals that are actualizing themselves. Then basically we could refer to the species or the types as the goals or some sort of anticipation that is present in that particular process. But to talk about types and species as entities that could be severed from the actualizing, becoming individuals or bodies is a mistake. This is wrong. This is a move of reification, which is not legitimate. So for Plessner, and he's very adamant about this, it is really wrong to talk about any type of strong teleology, even internal teleology. So the reason why I'm emphasizing this is because one of the Phils previously asked this question. And the only way I can make any sense of this is that basically, you know, probably the relationship between the individual and the species is as a relationship between individual notes and the melody. So when you start producing, like when certain notes start to appear, they are kind of, there's a certain anticipation in their movement that is leading towards some sort of a resolution. But it is only through this particular dynamism that you can kind of get a sense of where it is that they are moving. So they are kind of constituting a certain melody that is becoming a bit of a, if I use the language of dynamic systems theory, a tractor towards they are gravitating or to around which they are kind of circling. But again, what you need is basically the becoming of a certain something for you to be able to talk about a melody or a species. We can maybe talk about this later on. So he emphasizes that there's a certain tension present between the individual, so the actuality, and the type, which stands for possibility, and that life or life process is always a process of development and selection. So there is an ongoing a selection process happening. In what sense? He says that what is characteristic for the developing individual is a dual disparity. So this tension, individual versus type, actual versus possible, has two different manifestations. On the one hand, every individual belongs to a specific form, to a specific species. So among all the different species that can actualize themselves, among all the different possibilities, he is kind of embedded in the realm of a very specific actual possibility. So, you know, there is a specific form that is inherent to say a cat. Yeah, it's not a dog. That would be a different type of possibility. So there's a realm of possible possibilities. So there's a certain selection that occurs there, but there is also a certain specific capacity of that individual to actualize the possibilities that are available within that form. So even though there is a specific actual possibility which this particular individual is kind of embedded in, he or she will only be able to actualize some of these possibilities with regards to the circumstances in which that individual finds him or herself. And the germplasm, so this germplasm that we're now going back to, this reservoir, is basically a reservoir of possibilities that have not been actualized, but could have been. Yeah. So in the sense of, because of this tension between possibility and actuality, between type and individual, in order for the type to manifest other options as well, there has to be a certain materialization, so to speak, of these possibilities within the living being. And although living being will actualize only one specific, you know, life path, this actuality, as I wrote here at the bottom, always only covers up but never eradicates the potential that is permeating these possibilities. So the germplasm is an attempt to balance out the invariable potentiality. So there's a realm of possible, the realm of possibilities, but also a very variable ability to actualize this variable potentiality. So because of this tension, the germplasm is there that allows for, you know, the actualizations of the possibilities that weren't necessarily actualized throughout the living, throughout the life of one individual. And even though in a certain sense, you know, you can kind of point out certain formal aspects of I don't know, the species that a certain individual belongs to, and you can know a lot about this, there is still a certain contingency with regards to how a certain development will unfold. Now, Plessner at this point says that there is a certain essential law of life, namely the compulsion to differentiate. This means that the compulsion to take on different forms. And these two forms are open and closed. Open form stands for plant forms, closed for animal forms. But the question is, why is this the case? And here we can go back to what I said before, this immanent logic of life, or this immanent logic of positionality. These are my terms. These are not terms that Plessner himself uses. But what I said, so the immanent, what is characteristic of the immanent logic of life is this ongoing tension between the functional unity and the systemic unity. And this tension between openness and closedness. And, you know, he characterizes in different ways that the organism is what it is, but also what it is also in and beyond itself, that the living being is a mediated centeredness and so on and so forth. So this ongoing tension is characteristic for the living being. And the organic balance, the balance that we see in the living beings, is always a balance, as I said, in and through conflict, in and through oppositionality. It is never a static balance. You never get to the point where you have a, you know, centeredness as such. Because of this, we might see that this logic, immanent logic of life, is slowly kind of explicating various levels of autonomy. Yeah, what I mean by that is it adds new oppositionalities. It adds new conflicts that are inherent already in the very dynamic of life. And by doing so, it adds new dimensions or levels of centeredness. Yeah. So in a certain sense, there is a certain general dynamics that is characteristic for the living beings. This is the dynamics. But this dynamics can unfold and progressively kind of add additional folds towards greater and greater centeredness or autonomy of the organism in relation to its, say, positional field. It always requires a positional field, but it can eventually become more and more centered in the oppositionalities that it is confronted with. Yeah. So in a certain sense, this is the main essential feature of this logic of life, of this logic of oppositionality. And this is why the life, if I understand him correctly, has the compulsion to differentiate, because through this differentiation, it is actually achieving greater unity. Again, it is through oppositionality that it attains its centeredness of a sort. Yeah. And by centeredness, I mean the autonomy towards what it is confronted with. Okay, so what are these levels of autonomy? This is again my characterization. We have unicellular organisms, and these are, we could say, proto-life or really minimal life. Like these are expressions of minimal life. They don't even have proper organs. They have organelles, and there is no proper inner differentiation because there is no proper inner differentiation, there is also no proper differentiation with regards to the surrounding. He doesn't really say much here, so you know, I don't know what this means, but in general, I would say that, you know, this is basically the most rudimentary minimal form that this logic of life can take in the world or whatever. And then we have multicellular organisms. This is the domain of vitality proper, I would say. You know, this is where we get organs proper. But even here we have a certain hierarchy of this mediated centeredness. So this centeredness through oppositionality. We have open forms which are minimally centered in this way, and then we have closed forms which are more centered, and eccentric forms which are more centered but in a very specific way that, as we will see, makes them eccentric. But this is for later chapters. So today we will focus only on open and closed forms. So open form, this is basic. Open and closed form. This particular classification stems from Driesch. However, Driesch used it differently than Plessner does. But this is not crucial. Open forms are basically plants. So let us quickly go through some of the characteristics of plants according to Plessner. Fortunately enough, Plessner is kind enough to actually provide brief definitions, or at least delineations or explications of what he means by open and closed form. So with regards to the open form, he says the following: a form is open if the organism in all of its expressions of life is immediately incorporated into its surroundings and constitutes a non-self-sufficient segment of the life circle corresponding to it. So it is immediately incorporated into the surroundings, and it is non-self-sufficient segment of the life circle. This manifests itself in different ways, and basically Plessner is trying to depict some of these features or characteristics of the open form. So morphologically, what we can say about plants or open forms is that they develop expansively. So they don't constitute centers. You will not find centers, but they are basically kind of expanding and in a very centeredless manner. And for this reason, Plessner says that they are not even individuals, but are dividuals. So they constantly divide and they don't really have any center. They are unable to constitute a centeredness and autonomy in a certain sense. So there is a certain independency of parts that is way stronger than with animals, and we cannot talk about the individuality of the organism, but merely of the particularity of gestalt. So there is a certain particularity that is present and characteristic for each individual plant that you're looking at, but this is not proper individuality. And one of the ways that this also manifests itself, this time on the ontogenetical level, so on the developmental level, is that with plants, according to Plessner, what you get is a preservation or accumulation of specific phases. So when they develop, they go through phase A, and then they go through phase B, and then they go through phase C. And when they, for example, attain the phase C, this phase C is not a complete restructuration of the plant, but is merely an additional something to what was already acquired in A and B. And A and B are basically preserved. However, with animals, what you get is different developmental stages mean basically consecutive transformations of the whole. Then he goes through several other characteristics, and I'll just go briefly through some of them. I haven't, jotted down all of them. For example, he says that plants are never finished. There is a certain throughness that is typical of them. So they are absolutely devoted, so there is this feature of absolute devotement to the surrounding, and this doesn't mean that plants are not fully developed. Quite the contrary, it is precisely the fully developed plants that exhibit this unfinished nature in its maturity, so to speak. So when you have a fully developed plant, where you see that it is never finished, that is kind of ongoing, that it possesses this characteristic throughness. Then it has, the plant has unique metabolic cycles and cycles of reproduction. Here he mentions particularly this capacity to synthesize organic material from the inorganic material, that there is a predominance of assimilation present, and so on and so forth. There is a direct contact with the surrounding, which results in weak internal differentiation of tissues, metabolic stages, and whatnot. I would remind you here again of this interrelatedness of internal and external oppositionality. So if you have a weak external oppositionality, you will also have a weak internal oppositionality. So there are no clearly delineated organs, so to speak. And there is also a lack of locomotion. So most of the plants are sessile in nature, and so on and so forth. He also dispels some erroneous views about plants. He says that, you know, the views of certain behaviorists who wanted to claim that plants possess reflexes, that this is completely wrong, that talking about sensation and mobility in their proper sense of the in the proper sense of these terms is basically to contradict the nature of open form. So there is no there are no sensory motor loops proper in plants. Also, the idea propounded by Bergson and some of his followers that basically the plant is merely a sleeping animal, that is to say that it is the same as the plant, but it only lacks waking consciousness, is wrong, because it's not about not having or having consciousness, but about the fact that plants do not have a center. They do not have a proper center. And there are certain ways, also certain approaches that try to mythologize or mythicize plant, claiming that, you know, they are characterized by lavish self-surrender, by ecstatic emotional impulse, so something overwhelmingly positive, you know, something that is in opposition to human beings and animal beings, that there is like this certain something that is almost magical about plants. And he says that these are merely empty speculations, and that that they result in our overlooking what is characteristic of the open form. So let us now move to the closed form, the animals. This is what Plessner says about closed forms. He says the closed form immediately integrates the organism in all of its expression of life into its surroundings. So not immediately, as was the case with the plants, but immediately, and makes it into a self-sufficient segment of the life circle corresponding to it. So we see that we have here the opposite image of what was characteristic of the open form. So we have immediate integration, and we have a self-sufficient segment in relation to its positional field. So animals are not merely carriers of function, as is typical of plants, but are immediately integrated, and this immediate integration provides for a greater closure. As a rule, says Plessner, we can only speak of immediate integration into a context where there are intermediate links between the context and the integrated element. And this already hints at what he thinks is so specific or crucial for the plant. So in a certain sense, we might say that for the animal. So in a certain sense, we might say that the closed form or the animals are basically another phase or another step in the logic of oppositionality or positionality. Yeah? Another twist, another layer of explication of what is inherent in this particular logic. So when we talk about life in general, we saw that there is what is characteristic of it is this ongoing dynamic or dialectic between the functional unity and the systemic unity. So this is, we might say, the minimal logic, or the most broad sense of what it means to be alive or aliveness. And there's no differentiation present here yet at the level of the functional unity. So at the level of the unity of the variety. So the gestalt is basically, we might say, in a certain sense, pretty homogeneous. With closed form, however, what happens, and the reason why I say that this is another twist in the logic of oppositionality, is you get another polarity or another dialectic within this dialectic. So the functional unity itself becomes polarized or differentiated. You get a periphery and a center. So what you get is you get a functional unity that has a certain central unity. I think that this is how he calls it. That is present, and I'll explain what he means by this. So basically, we have here a further complexification of the minimal logics of aliveness, a further explication of its inherent dynamics. Okay, and this is basically we can talk about additional level of mediation. So there's already a mediation at the level of life in general, but here we have an additional twist, an additional level. So to make this somewhat clearer, he's trying to show how, for example, the metabolic balance differs from sensory motor balance. So metabolic balance is something that you would find in, say, bacteria, you would find this in plants and also in animals. But there is also a certain sensory motor balance. This is my designation. He just says this strange type of balance or something like this when he talks about the closed form. So metabolic balance, basically, what it means is that metabolic balance encompasses the whole functional unit. Yeah. So basically, it pertains to the Gestalt unit as a whole, and here, the mediated centrality is minimal. So you have certain organs that develop within it, and they are responsible for the mediacy of the relationship between the systemic unity and the functional unity. But it is, still minimal. This is basically the minimal requirement that you need in order for you to have aliveness. This minimal prevention of the living body coalescing with itself. So what we have here is basically immediate mediation. This is how we could, phrase it, that the mediation between the systemic unity and the functional unity is immediate. Yeah, we have mediation, but it is immediate. Now, with sensory motor balance, what happens is that you get this relationship between difference or polarity and unity within the functional unity, within the Gestalt. Because this Gestalt falls apart in a certain sense into two semi-autonomous parts, periphery and center. And in this regard, the mediated centrality becomes strengthened. Why does it become strengthened? Because I said that in living beings, centrality or unity is basically always mediated in and through polarity. So if you have two levels of polarity, there will be a stronger centrality, so to speak. Yeah. So what you get here is not immediate, but mediate mediation. Okay, so you have two twists. So what happens, says Plessner, is that the body doubles, which physiologically takes on the following characteristics. We have a central part, which is basically the central nervous system, and a periphery. And this periphery consists of sensory part and motor part, and they are mutually interrelated. So you have a certain part in the functional unity, which is mediating between these two aspects. Okay, it's integrating them into one, and they are basically two polar sides of the living being. One is receptive, passive, the other is active. Yeah. However, this distinction has an even more important correlate on the intuitive level, the one that is interesting for Plessner. So we have systemic unity, so living being as a whole, okay, living being as a wholeness, the Drieschien moment. And now we have the functional unity, the bodily Gestalt, the Köhlerian moment, which falls apart into two segments. So we still have the functional unity. However, there is a certain polarity within this unity between central parts and peripheral parts. So the organisms become structured in a way where you basically get two poles. And what you need is something that will mediate between these two poles. So you get a center within this particular functional unity. Yeah. And this center becomes, you could say, an additional center, an additional core, virtual core, which is basically a representation of the functional unity, of certain parts of the functional unity. And this is basically the living body, or sorry, the lived body. This is the lived body of the living being. So this means that the living organism as a whole is no longer immediately the unity of the organs, but is this unity only by way of the center. Okay, so now there is a certain center through which this mediate unity is mediated. So that's why we have mediated mediacy. So no longer is there just systemic unity that is dialectically related to functional unity through the organs, But now we have the systemic unity, which is immediately related through the functional unity, through the central unity, which is basically, in a certain sense, part of the functional unity, but in a way that is kind of over and above it, because it represents it and allows it to control it. I have no idea how the central unity pertains to the systemic unity as such, and what the relationships between these three aspects are, but this is basically, in a certain sense, the crucial point. So this central unity is part of the functional unity and therefore dependent on it, but it is also outside the functional unity, and thus the functional unity is partly dependent on it. That means that, once this center constitutes itself, it is able to govern the functional unity that is not in a way that is not present in the open form. And it does so by basically representing certain parts of the functional unity, which it now can relate to, and which is its lived body. So what you get, in a certain sense, is the body of the animal folding in itself or on itself, and basically splitting. The only way that it is a whole is, again, through activity. Yeah, but in a certain sense, this activity acquires two new poles. So the body, says Plessner, has become the intermediary layer between the living being and the medium. So its body, Körper, has become its lived body, Leib, that concrete center by virtue of which the living subject is connected with its surrounding field. So once this happens, once you get this additional twist, you get Leib, so a concrete center, and this constitutes a proper autonomy. This is where you really get proper autonomy, in the sense of now the organism is properly, it is something that is both governed, and that is something that both governs and is being governed. So once you have this folding on itself of the body, you get this self-referentiality and thus self-dependence, but also self-independence. So the virtual self, the new center, is independent to a certain degree from its physical gestalt. Not completely, but to a certain degree. And when this happens, the organism can actually relate to its environment differently. Plessner says that now the organism, the animal, will relate to its environment as across a chasm. So there is no longer immediate embeddedness into its surrounding, but there is a chasm that is separating the organism. Yeah, and this is also what allows for the two-fold relationship with the environment: passivity, which is acceptance and openness, and activity, grasping distance. So here you basically get this. Only when you really have this center is it possible for this organism to be autonomous enough to grasp and distance itself. Yeah, but also to have the passivity and openness present that is also present. In a certain sense, in a rudimentary form, this is already present in the plant, but to a limited degree. So because of this mediation that is characteristic of the closed form, that is to say of the animal, the positional field of the animal is open. So interestingly enough, so when you have an open form, the positional field in a certain sense is closed, because the organism is just embedded into it. So, it's there and it's constantly kind of anchored in it. But here, because you have a closed form, that is to say a properly autonomous form, the positional field becomes open in the sense that it can change. So this autonomous form can alter its environment. And this is also what and because of this, there is a certain primal unfulfilledness of the animal, or the closed form. So animals become, as Plessner cogently puts it, needy thing seeking fulfillment. So they become needy things seeking fulfillment. And they are characterized by drives. So these drives are responsible for their restless drivenness, peacelessness, and compulsion to fight, which has very interesting parallels to the Buddhist notion of thirst or tanha as being the foundation of suffering. And maybe we can touch upon this later on. And they are also mobile beings, so they can move about, they can change their environment, and they're constantly kind of looking this fulfillment, but they can never fully satiate their thirst. And also additional two features, this should be 3 and 4, not 1 and 2, is the stronger differentiation. So basically the exact opposite of the open form. With open form, we said that there was a weak differentiation. Here we have stronger differentiation, because once you have a stronger polarization between the organism and its environment, you will also have a stronger polarization within the organism. And also another feature, that basically the closed form lives off life. So it requires other life to survive. So unlike the animal, which is embedded in its environment and is capable of synthesizing organic material from the inorganic material, this is something that is no longer possible for the closed form. So what it acquires in autonomy, it loses in a certain stability, or a certain, what would you call it? I don't know. Yeah, stability would probably be it. So this, I think, is basically it. It was a tough ride. So yeah, any comments on this weird, convoluted, meandering chapter, or half of the chapter?
Well, I think it's a shame that this chapter is so convoluted, because in a certain sense, I think the entire project rests on this chapter, because I feel like here, this is the place where Plessner basically does the deduction from the I don't know, from the boundary, and then in the fourth chapter, in this chapter, this is where he's supposed to do the whole magic of how we can arrive from this intuitively, from this intuited boundary to all these categories, modals, whatever, of life. But he does this in such a bewildering fashion that you're never sure if you're reading a mystical text or if you're just too stupid to follow the intricate thought pattern, that I feel like he's missing a very important middle here in the entire book. Because then you come to the next chapter and everything starts becoming clear. Sure, animals, it's very nice, and then the human, that part is very much relatable because it becomes like existential. The thing is, it rests on this part, and you're not really sure if you understand this part, because I'm not sure if it's entirely hermeneutically possible to understand it perfectly.
That's actually a good point. I had the basically almost identical feel about this particular chapter. You can see it's a central one. It's the the center that gets constituted in the book, but so the previous chapters build up to this, and then the other chapters are in a certain sense explication of what is kind of deduced here, as you pointed out. But because this chapter is so convoluted and dense and so obscure in many different ways, it's then really difficult to kind of have a good grasp of the foundations, a solid grasp of the basis on which he's kind of doing some other stuff later on. So yeah, that's definitely a problem here.
Just to add this, because the thing that interests me most about Plessner is this eccentric positionality of the human and all the existential implications which he derives from that. I think that's a very fascinating aspect of his work, and the way he sort of sells it is that I have this anthropology, which it is based on a philosophy of life, a philosophy of biology, of a philosophy of a human as a natural being. But that's the problem. So say I want to use the idea of the eccentric positionality, and I also sell it. It's kind of founded on biology or something, but I don't really know how the links follow. And I think that's a real shame. So what do you even do in a situation like that? Because let's say that I write a paper in which I try to interpret this, but essentially I'll always be stuck in this interpretive box, and then someone else will come. No, you interpreted that sentence differently, and then ultimately where do we get using this method? Just arguing about words in a certain sense. That's kind of my fear, because I've invested so much time in Plessner by now. This is like my fourth reading, and I still don't feel like I got this middle part, which I think is the main the main thing to really get what he's after later on.
You can use it in a way that is quite non-committal, in the sense of you can use the notion, the idea, and you can use it, let's say, descriptively or contextually with regards to what it is that you are writing about, and you just introduce it as, you know, something that stands for a certain characteristic of human beings. It can be, let's say, a descriptive characteristic. It doesn't have to be founded, or you can use some different foundation for it. You know, you don't necessarily have to follow through in the Plessnerian sense. You can maybe, for instance, I have found it very useful to combine Plessner with Merleau-Ponty and Canguilhem, and this was actually something that was more useful for what I was doing. I think, I don't know, maybe after some time, especially now that I'm kind of trying to also get into the earlier works by Plessner, if I ever feel confident enough about his methodology, I would be willing to incorporate more of his ideas. But at this point, it's just, you know, kind of, it's basically impossible to grounding. So taking some of the notions by Plessner and basically trying to reformulate them and maybe rehash the project that he's trying to do would basically be, I would say, a very valuable project in and of itself, but it's a separate project, yeah. So unless you kind of feel that this is some sort of a calling that you would like to do, it would be a marvelous calling, by the way, and it would have important implications. Not only because once somebody would do this, if somebody would be able to do this in a way that would be clearer, it would be also way easier to put Plessner then into a more fruitful and productive dialogue with many other stuff. As it stands now, I think that most people would still be kind of, you know, I find this fascinating, but I don't really know what to do with it. And I have no idea how to, say, translate some of the stuff that he's doing in autopoetic language, or even I don't know, in certain Merleau-Pontian things. Probably easier in many ways, but still, you know, it's quite a challenge. So I would recommend that, so that you basically use some of the ideas and notions, and unless the project that you're working on requires that you point out the specific way in which this is grounded, I don't think you have to do it. You know, you can still operate with this, and it can be useful in what you're doing.
Okay. So is it my turn? Okay. I was really struggling, well, with the whole chapter, but especially with the section on plants, because it was super hard for me to see how, like, from the beginning, like he was talking about life as this like oppositionality, this position, like oppositionality and positionality, differentiation and closeness, and then suddenly like plants are alive. But like, and he just said like they like meet the minimal logics of aliveness, as you stated. But like, I don't know, see how, like all the time he said like they are completely open, they don't have a center, but like they somehow have a center. I guess I didn't understand well, but I don't know. I don't see how like they are alive in his sense. Like he was talking about all the requirements of animal life, but now he says, okay, yeah, but plants do not meet those requirements. But okay, that's my first questions. And also like this having a lived body. So plants do not have a lived body, only have a living body. But well, I don't even see how they have a living body. But
they do have a lived body. When we say, Sebastian, they don't have a physical body as something represented outside of them. Like they are the lived body essentially. Or did I misunderstand everything?
I think that no, that the category of lived body is inappropriate for plants. So you have to have a center in order for you to have a lived body. Otherwise, there's no lived body. You have a living body. You have an organic, vital body, but you don't have a lived body. So there is a körper, no life, however. I don't know. Does anybody want to give this a go so that I won't be talking?
I have also a question about how he's using those two terms, körper and life, because so maybe we can continue maybe later, but if you want to maybe answer the first question, Susanna had first.
Yeah. Susanna, this is how I understand him. So there is a minimal criterion for aliveness, which basically requires you to have this dialectic between the systemic unity and the physical unity. Yeah. And as long as this is met, you have aliveness. It can manifest itself in a way where it's closer in a certain sense to what you find in physical Gestalten. So physical Gestalten that are, say, more directly influenced by their surrounding, yeah. But plants would not fall into this category because they still exhibit this these main features of the boundedness. So there is still something that you could say that it is that they are not only what they are, but also beyond themselves and in themselves. But in a minimal sense, because they're still very much anchored in their kind of surrounding. So the thing that is confusing here to a certain degree is that when Plessner is talking about vitality in general, what he uses is very close to what is characteristic of the closed form, to the animal form. So the impression that you get is like you're expecting to have something like an animal. But then he says, this is not necessarily the case. It doesn't have to be. So there are levels of this. Yeah. So there is like a minimal logics of life. And the main characteristic of it is this mediated centeredness of sorts. So this achieving of unity through polarity. And basically this boils down to processuality and dynamism and basically what is characteristic of boundary. The thing is that for him, boundary is basically almost the better term would be bounding. And instead of positionality would be positioning. Because this is what is crucial. If you don't have that, you're unable to bridge any of these things. So it is only if you want to be, according to Plessner, able to think about, how is unity in polarity possible, you need something that is constantly active. It can only be achieved through actualization. And when you have that, you have a living something. And this can be achieved in many different ways. And with plants, it is achieved in a minimal way, in the sense of that you still have this strong connectedness with the surrounding. You have autonomy of sorts because there is a certain closedness. Otherwise, the plants would not be alive. There would be no logics of positionality and oppositionality and dynamism and what have you. But it is a minimal sort. Now, he doesn't provide any criteria when does one become the other and what exactly does that mean, unfortunately. So I'm just kind of, using very vague descriptive things that he also uses. So that there's very little deduction in his deductive process. The reason why this is also something I was thinking about, that so his deduction is probably, he's kind of looking at what is given to you in intuition, and then he's kind of trying to distill the a priori categories. This is something that Timothy raised in the last meeting. So what does it mean to be, now whether this is successful or not, sometimes it just seems so contingent that, you're like, if this is a priori philosophy, then I can do it as well. So I think, that's the closest I would get to this particular answer. It's very unsatisfying in the sense of a lot of answers remained, questions remained unanswered. So
yeah, and we also have the case of some animals which are not truly centralized. The non it's translated, and I guess in German it's also decentralized, but I guess the more accurate thing to say would be the non-centralized yet animals. So it also gets confusing here where the
and the transitional forms, right?
Yeah.
So would somebody want to take the lived thing and living thing? I don't want to.
I may have a question for those who really read the book, the whole thing several times. How do you understand his use of Leib and Körper? Is this the way how he's understanding this? Is it Husserlian, or is it more broad? Because
interestingly enough, he introduced the distinction first. It wasn't.
He introduced it first.
He was the one who was first using it, from what I was able to.
Are you sure? But
almost 100%, yes.
Really?
Yeah, I don't think that necessarily Husserl took it from him, but he made this distinction of Leib and Körper, and he was talking about it in several other texts as well. So I don't know.
Unlikely to me, because Husserl is using it much earlier now.
Yeah, but the thing is that he wasn't, that the texts where he's using it weren't published, and he wasn't using it as a category until later on. So he might have picked it up.
When was he born, Plessner?
I forgot, but I know that he attended Husserl's lectures, so he might have come across the terms or distinctions there. But so in his writings, I think he introduces the distinction earlier than Husserl does in a clear way. Because think about it, ideas too weren't published till posthumously.
Yeah.
And this is where
they had some interaction with Husserl also.
Yeah. So he I think he could have picked it up there, like the conceptual maybe, or the terminological, but then he kind of spelled it out in the sense of this distinction that you get. I wouldn't say that they are necessarily that they completely overlap or something like that. No.
It's interesting that here he says that we find this insight of the distinction between the lived body and the physical body already in Hegel. He says that on page 31. So that's an interesting archaeological project as well.
Yeah. For me, it's a bit confusing, the translation. Like that's why I'm asking whether it is kind of overlapping with Husserl or not, because Husserl Leib is not the lived body. This is really, I don't know, strange convention. If you really look at what Husserl means by Leib, it's not lived body, it's living body or someone's body. It's more broader. I don't understand why they translate like that, but I have a hard time understanding this, because you also said the Körper is living body and the Leib is lived body, but this isn't completely different.
Okay, I would just say, I wouldn't even say living body. I would maybe say, body, like the body, like when you have the functional unity, Gestalt unity of the living system. That's the Körper. That's the Körper that you get. And you know, you can say living body, but of course you can then qualify it in the sense of, I'm using this in a Plessnerian context. It's not. It's very problematic to which term we will designate. I agree with you completely, but the lived body for him is basically where, because of this center that gets constituted, an additional center, it's basically the self or the ego, or the, as you will see, is something where this then body acquires a certain self-referentiality and becomes not only I don't even know how to put it this in the Plessnerian terms, but it just becomes, if I understand him completely, that which is kind of given to itself through this center. So there's a certain segment that becomes the domain through which you start operating with something.
I think this corresponds quite nicely to the idea of someone's body. You know, one's body, it's like this eigen property or aspect. Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. That's. Can you maybe say a bit more on this?
You know, for example, Merleau-Ponty doesn't have that much the polarity between subjective body and objective body, but le corps propre, someone's body, you know, one's body. It's like this self-referentiality, or there is kind of center to which the body is oriented, and that has nothing to do with the body being only subjective or subjectively lived. You know, so he's trying, you know, he's directed to overcome this polarity between subjective objective, because within the body, le corps propre, someone's body, it's both subjective and objective. That's the point.
This is a really good point. Okay, pretty much, you go first. You go first.
I was just gonna say that this is essentially, I think in the introduction to the translation, Bernstein makes this point that this is Plessner's contribution to making this distinction more explicit between the this more subjective kind of body, the lived body, and the physical body, as the human comes to see his own body as some kind of a body in physical space. And I think in the later chapters, this distinction becomes clear when we get to humans, when we actually have this emergence of a physical body in addition to lived body, both of which you are in a certain way. But so he establishes this distinction between the two. Whereas we're talking about the living body earlier on, I think this is essentially just another term, a better term perhaps would be to just say a living being. That's a category above all of these, isn't it?
No. The living being would be the living wholeness. So you have to be careful there. The living wholeness is the systemic unity. The living body, in this sense, would be the body, which is the functional unity, so the Gestalt part. So this is where the split happens. It's different from the living being. The living being as a whole is differentiated from this. So the systemic unity is still there, like this. And it's not clear how the systemic unity then enters the picture. Whether systemic unity is kind of something that is then mediated through the central new self, you know. So these distinctions that he introduces, like eventually you don't really know how they nicely fit. So what happens is, you know, you have systemic unity, you have functional unity. Within the functional unity, you get an additional polarity. So within the functional unity itself, you get a certain polarization, and this polarization needs to be resolved. Otherwise, the organism will fall apart. So another unity gets created. But you already had, so the centered unity, within this Gestalt. But then there's this systemic unity of a living being as a whole, which also serves as some sort of a minimal centeredness of which he was talking about previously. Now, what the heck happens with this centeredness? Is this something that is then, you know, kind of becomes a pin, like a touching point with this new center, or is it somewhere else? So it's very, I try to kind of see if, you know, but he doesn't spell it out. He never spells it out. So he just makes it clear that, you know, we have to differentiate this from the living body, living being as a whole. And living being as a whole is still the systemic unity that he's talking about. So this is still there. The only difference is that what happens is that you get this additional twist now, and this twist then changes everything in a certain sense. So it's possible that the centered unity, once you get it, that basically this systemic unity, which has operated as a center, gets kind of latched onto this or whatnot. I don't know. I honestly don't know. So I'm kind of, it's almost like, you know, building Lego blocks or something. Where does this piece fit? Well, maybe here. I don't know. What do you get if I put it here? Well, I don't know. It's just, it's confusing a bit.
I'm just not sure how consistently he uses these terms. Because, for example, when we look at the point where he introduces the notion of the boundary, he says that living bodies appear to us as exhibiting. And I get this constant feeling as though sometimes he's saying living being, sometimes he's saying living bodies, sometimes he's saying living wholeness. I'm not sure he uses these terms as strictly as you interpreted them. So
yeah, for sure. But even here,
at this point, I'm not sure
is
he using them strictly.
Living beings exhibit. So you see a living body, and it exhibits this and this. So it exhibits what is not given in it, what is not given in it as a body that you see. So he is more, I would agree with you, he's not being super systematic with regards to this. But for the most part, he does use it in a specific manner. Now, you know, if we went through all the examples, we would probably see that there is quite a lot of divergence, and in this particular chapter, boy, does he use a lot of synonyms for the same ideas. So, for example, when I'm using functional unity and systemic unity, like he uses, I think that 5 or 6 synonyms for both, you know, just like throwing them around. So sometimes he talks about gestalt, sometimes about body, sometimes it's sometimes, you know, he would say like gestalt whole, but then he says previously he said whole should be only for the systemic unity, so this is the wholeness. But then you have wholeness sometimes, and that the other thing is, you know, gestalt whole. So it's just it's a mess with regards to this, and unity with regards to multiplicity, and unity over and above multiplicity, that's the systemic unity. So
that's pretty discouraging to hear you guys who have read already several times.
It is. I mean,
it is discouraging.
But another thing that is really, really cool is that once you get to certain parts, they can be just brilliant, downright, like this is wow, this is. And when we will get to the human form and animal form and some of the things that he'll be doing, you'll be just like, this is just as fascinating, and you know, so you get even more frustrated because these other parts are the way they are. So yes, Susanna.
Your mic is off.
Mic is off.
Yeah, I also find like very obscure the notion of representation. Like, how does this representation happen? Like, how does the like the center represents the functional unit, and how is it the same kind of representations that the representation of the organs of the whole? I don't know. I struggle with every time he talks about its representation. I really struggle.
Yeah, so representation, I think that it's definitely not used in the sense that it is kind of the triggering point for most people in the debate of representationalism, anti-representationalism. So that's probably clear from the very point. But how this is supposed to happen and what it encompasses, I'm not really confident. I don't really know. I have the impression that it that this representation is, no, I don't know that if I would be able to make a good good clarification here. Would anybody try to add something to this? I don't know, maybe one thing is that so I don't know, once you get this center, I think that this center has the capacity to be properly affected and then properly respond to this affection. And when this happens, there is, so the center also mediates between the affection and the mobility, and mobility and the affection. So maybe in this way, certain parts of the living body, if we use this term, becomes part of the lived body when they become integrated in this newly acquired centrality. So that I don't really know. So
I was thinking maybe of the notion of body schema, but I don't know if like the contemporary notion. I don't know.
Yeah, could be that this is what this meant by this, that he's kind of alluding to something like a body schema. So the powers of motility and sensibility and their interrelational loops or what have you, I don't know, something like that, maybe. Rudimentary body schema. We have a specialist here for body schema. So Jan.
Yeah, but there are many people who also talk about body schema as a representation.
But I don't think that he's using this term. I think it's using, we shouldn't be stuck on the term itself. I think that he's just using a notion, not necessarily as proper representation.
Yeah, I mean, but the problem itself, can be treated in different ways, and some people treat it like, with the help of the notion of representation, or in a representationalist way, and other people don't. So it doesn't help, at least from my point of view, to link it to the body schema, because body schema doesn't give the answer. I don't know, but it could be something like that.
So what would be maybe a useful account or definition of body schema that might fit to a certain degree to what the lived body would be in this particular? I mean, even we are completely groping in the dark now, so it doesn't really matter. And some of the things would become somewhat clearer in later chapters, in the next one already. But I can't, I haven't read those sections yet, so I don't remember, but I know that he addresses some of these points. But it could be something like that, right? This motility, so to speak, and sensibility and their interrelatedness.
For me, it's somewhat connecting to the systemic unity, maybe, because the body schema is something that it doesn't inform you only about how things are at the moment, but how they can be, or what is possible. So, but I don't know.
Okay, that's actually interesting and good, because this would then provide a nice little link between what I said, that we don't really know what the relationship is here then between functional unity, this newly central unity, and the systemic unity. So this might be then a mediation of sorts between the two, like a way more centralized mediation, where you actually get a new structure that is related to it, and you maybe, I don't know.
Sounds good.
Everything. Yeah, I don't know. Any further comments or questions or befuddlements or confusions.
I guess one thing that I've been thinking about is that he said that he's going to try to uncover what the organic models of life are, and I wonder what do you think? What are the models he has discovered so far? Because I think he never quite says these are the this is a list of all the models. He just says he's going to look for them and deduce them, and but what are they?
This is precisely like Heidegger and existential in Being and Time. So, you know, I'm going to provide an alternative to Aristotelian approach and the categories. So these will be existentials, and then you have to kind of decipher which are these existential. Is this like a closed list, or are these? So I would say boundedness, positionality, and then
what about assimilation and dissimilation? Is that a modal?
I don't think that this is necessarily a model, maybe more of a construction, deconstruction, assimilation, dissimilation, maybe, yeah, maybe.
I mean, because he says, he talks about modals as though he's going to deduce them from boundedness, if I remember correctly. So I think we are at the point where we're supposed to be seeing this deduction. This is one modal, this is the next modal. And I suppose, in the way I read it, it's for example, assimilation and dissimilation. It's adaptation and adaptedness. I think that's also in this area. It's not quite clear how do you define this as a modal? It's all very descriptive.
I would say that the boundedness and positionality, and this positionality with its twofold aspect of being what you are and being in and outside of yourself. So these are like two crucial modals. And then related to this is I would guess that the having organs. I actually think that's a dark model.
I would agree. Yeah. I mean, because we can't have life without organs. It is a precondition of all life. Yeah, what about, for example, this when he talks about the compulsion to differentiate into either the plant form or the animal form? Is that also a modal?
Okay. No.
Because then I think you get a problem. What about all the specific forms of animal life, as he describes them? Are they also modals of life? Because they are modals of life only of the animal form of life. You don't need them for plant life to exist. So is he really talking about modals at that point? Because this is going to be more relevant next time when we're actually dealing with the animal form.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether the open and closed forms are modals. I think that, you know, everything that is, let's say, characteristic for life as such would probably fall into the category of modality, right? And or would you say that maybe not the forms themselves, but maybe just this differentiation into forms or hierarchy of forms, maybe that hierarchy of forms where you have like this progressive autonomy or whatnot, or something like that.
But on the other hand, he says that this tendency is a feature of particularly multicellular organization. But then we do have unicellular organisms which are living, and therefore can this still be called, this compulsion to differentiation be called a modal, given that there are forms of life?
But this is precisely what is kind of closely related to what we were talking about previously. So where you have the difference between organelles and organs. So there is some sort of a minimal differentiation which is required always. So you have to have it, even if it's not proper. Okay. But again,
that's very loose.
Very extremely loose. So like it's Like
he
that.
also has this part about differentiation, in sexual differentiation, whether there are males and females. And here he sort of says, yes, there's this qualitative, this essential difference. But in the appendix, he kind of changes his mind because some other thinker responded to him who said that there are also asexual there's asexual reproduction as well, and there's sexual inversions in nature and stuff. So he kind of changes his mind about that.
So that there goes one model.
Yeah.
Just lost the model here.
It's not a priori.
Yeah, but the thing is, this is precisely what you were saying here. I think he's trying to say you can only get to a priori through what is given, basically, right? You cannot. It's not a priori that you will kind of deduce it outside of. So you have to find it in experience, but it is supposed to be some sort of a structuration of that particular experience. So you find it there for sure, but he just would probably say, well, you know, I mischaracterized one particular feature. It's very loose.
I mean, because in the end, I feel like almost all we can say is that the model of life is differentiation. You have boundaries, and then there's just a lot of differentiation. Although I guess, I mean, we do have reproduction. I think that can be called a model as well. And adaptation, there also has to be adaptation, or life cannot be without adaptedness and adaptation, all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it would be nice to have a list. Here
It's
they
nice
are.
to have a list, and also what he means and how they kind of interrelate, and what exactly the overall project is. I don't know. For me personally, like the most interesting stuff with regards to Plessner is the attempt to characterize what I was kind of toying around with in today's presentation of this logics of life, you know, where you have the logics of positionality, which is basically always a logics of oppositionality, and how this differencing relating is kind of characteristic for the living being, and the only way that it can be actualized is by living being something that is an ongoing activity. So the living being, the reason why it's interesting and the reason why it cannot be overlooked is because with living being, what you get is precisely the realm and domain where the non-duality is taking place. So it's basically, in a certain sense, it is what allows you to kind of deduce or elucidate a logics that is inherently non-dual in that regard, because it's processual. And in this regard, it's basically, you know, you kind of, if you don't take it seriously, or if you try to develop it from something else, you will have problems, because you will not be able to do so. And also, it is questionable whether, in a certain sense, the other ways of thinking about things are not basically something that is stemming from this particular vital logic. So a lot to be said there, but you know, this is what I personally find most interesting, that the way that he's going around with this particular way of what it means to be a bounded being, and what you can get from that, and you know, different twists and turns. A lot of the stuff is, yeah, quite problematic, and I wouldn't even be willing to follow him there. And it's not really even important, but I think that focusing on this type of stuff is most rewarding, at least for me, you know. Yeah. Okay. Any further comments, or should we wrap this up for today? Yeah. Okay. Then thank you all for coming, and I'll be seeing you. When's the next meeting? In
Next month or something.
Third.
It's a while, I think.
3rd of June. So that's 3 weeks again. So enough time to thoroughly read the next section. Yeah. Okay. Be well. See you. Ciao.
Bye.